Well, has the China-Australia relationship ever been this crook? Now, many Australians might welcome the state of those relations, given how incompetent, or worse, partly devious the regime was, I'm being very kind here, when they first learned about a new coronavirus. Just because we call for an independent inquiry into the origins of this virus, please forgive us for wanting to learn something to prevent another pandemic. And so the Chinese threatened to ban Australian beef and Australian wine. And that's what they did, using words like, the Chinese people might not choose to drink Australian wine or eat Australian beef, is just communist doublespeak. The Chinese people don't have choices. I've lived there. The government chooses what's for sale. But how dare they? This is entirely China's fault, and any attempt to besmirch calls for an independent inquiry is nothing but a communist cover-up. And how's this editor of China's state-run Global Times saying Australia was just gum stuck to the bottom of China's shoe? It is all too aggressive and defensive for mine. Have you noticed that? They don't want the world to know the truth. They don't want the world to know the truth desperately. Maybe because the truth is worse than we even think we know. In the United States, where they've just recorded their 1 millionth case, allegations are surfacing, accusing China of all sorts of deliberately devious behaviour in relation to the virus. Some feasible, some not so feasible. One such commentator is international business expert and economic analyst Danielle DiMartino Booth. Now, if you follow current affairs in the US, it is very difficult to miss her strident views as Danielle appears on media such as Bloomberg, CNBC, Fox Business, Institutional Investor, Yahoo Finance and the Wall Street Journal. She says China has declared war on the world with this virus. She joined me earlier today from her home in Texas. Now, let's start at the simple point at which this virus was first known. We know that the Chinese delayed the revealing of information related to the acknowledgement of a virus existing in Wuhan for a certain period of time, which allowed millions to get out of the province and go to other parts of China and the world. How incompetent was that, or how devious was that, or was it a little bit of both?
Well, I'm not so sure that I would attach the word incompetence as much as I would say that it was the sin of omission writ large. There was a lot on the line for China economically. The trade war with the United States had already done untold damage to their economy that was sliding to a 30-year, 3-decade low rate of growth. And I think that they put the economics of the country in front of the welfare, not only of their own countrymen and countrywomen, but that of the rest of the world.
So hang on, you're suggesting here that this delay may have been part of some strategy to pull the Western world down with them economically?
Not necessarily pull the rest of the Western world down, but there was a trade deal that was being negotiated at the time. There were contingencies of American trade diplomats and Chinese trade diplomats flying halfway around the world, with the media following them every step of the way. And from what we know here in the United States, President Trump was receiving briefings from his intelligence council as early as late December, early January, and the Chinese authorities knew as early as very early December, if not mid-November, that the virus was in existence, and yet the pomp and circumstance continued through the January the 15th signing of the trade deal that had an exigent circumstances, unforeseen circumstances clause within it that basically allowed both parties to bow out in the event of an unforeseen circumstance that both knew of at the time of the signing. I
remember hearing your president talk about the fact that, this was the biggest deal anyone had ever seen. The Chinese were really quiet after it was signed, though. It appeared to the rest of the world that America got the best part of that deal. And do you think that that was the motivation for China to turn on the rest of the world with this virus?
Well, look, the one thing I don't know, I'm not a scientist, and I certainly don't have any kind of inside information about the origins of the virus itself. But I do know that on the parts of both President Trump here in the United States and Chinese officials there, that an agreement was signed that I would say was not in good faith. had the proceedings, had the negotiations not continued along in a friendly manner, then there was the threat of a further imposition of tariffs on the part of the United States to China. So in a way, China was playing defense, but by the same token, knowing very well that because of the existence of this virus, that they would really never have to come through with what they were committing to do in terms of purchases from the United States.
So at the very least, this was convenient for China in that they wouldn't have to go through with their commitments related to the December 15 trade deal because of this clause about pandemics, etc.
Because of this unforeseen circumstances, those are the words that are in Section 7.6 in the trade deal that trade experts have said are very common in industrial contracts where force majeure is claimed. We've certainly seen quite a bit of that around resource shipments throughout the world as this COVID pandemic has unfolded, but they're very rare to see in trade deals. And yet, as early as September, China was insisting that this clause be included in the trade deal.
So on January the 15th, are you saying that they knew they had an out clause and so therefore they knew they had a virus in their midst as well, and the two swam together quite easily for the Chinese?
I'm saying that both the United States and China knew that the clause was in the trade deal, and that they both signed it.
So China now has no obligation to follow any of their commitments signed in that deal?
We don't know that for a fact. What the trade deal stipulates is that you have to go back to the negotiating table. And we know how long it took for the United States and China to negotiate a deal in the first place. And I dare say that given the saber rattling that's going on the parts of both governments, that going back to a fair and friendly negotiating table that's the furthest thing I can see from happening going forward.
OK, take your economic hat off for a second and put your legal hat on. If a private company had incompetently or deceptively unleashed this virus from a lab somewhere in the world, and it had killed 215,000 people, which this virus has, there would be enormous legal repercussions following that. Why can't the world sue China for what's occurred?
Well, I have to say I am no legal expert, but I do know enough from the law classes that I have had in my life, whether it be in business school or when I received my journalism degree. I've taken extensive law classes. I do know that there's something that's called prima facie evidence. And if China knew about the existence of this virus as early as mid-November, let's give them just give them a little bit of grace and say the beginning of December. There was still an inordinate amount of time that travel was allowed outside of the country. We know that the main cluster in Italy started in an area where Chinese migrant workers were making Italian goods, Italian luxury goods. We know that outside of Seattle in the United States, that there were also large communities of Chinese who had, again, been traveling unfettered. At the very least, there's negligence on the part of China, and I don't want to throw any legal terminology out there because, again, I'm not an attorney, but I can say that there is enough evidence that there certainly does need to be an investigation, and it needs to be undertaken on the part of many, many countries, not just one against the other.
Our Prime Minister here is pushing very hard for an independent inquiry into how this pandemic was sourced and how it started. It seems logical that you would have one of those to try and prevent it happening again. The Chinese have responded by saying, well, maybe China won't buy our beef, they won't drink our wine from now on. It's such a silly threat. Can you believe the height of the Chinese reacting to Australia that way?
You know, look, as I said before we started this interview, I was able to visit your wonderful country, and I was stupefied at the amount of ownership that China has taken of Australian resources, of Australian ports, of Australian islands, and to make such a threat to me when it is for the greater good of the world community at large to know what the origin of this virus is. That is so that we can prevent and be well prepared in the future in the event of the next outbreak. It is simply irresponsible.
And when you talk about 215,000 deaths and some reparations related to that, what about the economic ruin of the world? They've got to take responsibility for that as well, don't they?
Well, look, again, the World Health Organization said on several occasions that it was going to be allowed into Wuhan, and it never seemed to gain admission. So my greatest concern is not that we start to place dollar figures on what potential reparations should be, but that we are able to even get an investigation undergoing on the part of the global community.
I thank you very much for your time. Your insight is quite valuable. Thank you, Danielle.